Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Michael Zürn. I'm from the WZB, Berlin Social Science Center, and I'm very happy and very proud that I was asked to chair this first panel here, especially given the distinguished participants. I think the best, given the time management pressure that we have, is that I introduce all the members of this panel briefly, and then we go through the papers in order of the program. By the way, I realized now why they asked me as a German to chair this first panel, given that there is obviously now some time constraint, and I have to domesticate all the participants of this panel and ask them to stay within their 15 minutes. We have as first paper giver Lebow with his paper on Beyond Hegemony, the US and the Rising Powers. Then we go on with Karen Smith, University of Capetown, an African perspective on world order. Then we have Paulo Esteves here from Sao Paulo with his contribution on the BRICS effect, multilateralism and its discontents. Then finally, as paper giver, Sumit Ganguly, Indiana University. He asks question about the role of India in the liberal order. And then at the end, and finally, Charles Kupchan from Georgetown University will all bind it together and give critical comments and an integration of all what we heard within 15 minutes, and we look forward to this as well. Having said all this, and reminding you again to the 15 minutes, I pass on the word to Matt.
Thank you very much, Michael. If I adjust the mic like this, does it work in the room? Yes. Give a shout if something happens. I submitted a paper which addresses in some detail the concept of hegemony and asks several what I think are fundamental questions about it. First, is hegemony a fact or a fiction? Secondly, what does the liberal and realist discourse about hegemony tell you about the people who write these theories in comparison to what it might tell you about the world? And thirdly, if we turn to the original account of hegemony on which realist and liberal discourses rest, the work of Charles Kindleberger, and apply his categories of what a hegemon should do to the United States, to what extent does it conform? And I'm going to argue, I'll let the cat out of the bag at the outset, that it suggests the U.S. Never had more than a very temporary, limited hegemony in the few years following World War II, and that in recent decades, rather than attempting to perform the role of hegemony, the United States in both the economic and political sphere has behaved in ways contrary to it, which threaten rather than sustain political and economic order. And thus, it really is quite anomalous that there is this large consensus in the U.S. international relations literature that the U.S. is a hegemon, that a hegemon is necessary to maintain order, and that people around the world desperately want the U.S. to maintain its position. I will return to this, but I want to start by going back a step and addressing the question of hegemony in a more fundamental sense, and in particular, looking at the question of power transition, which after all is central to the BRICS, to people's analysis of the kinds of goals they might pursue, and how existing great powers might respond to them. With Benjamin Valentino, I published an article several years ago in which we explored historically the phenomenon of power transition. Based on a data set that we put together, I further elaborated this in a book that I published in 2010 called Why Nations Fight. And I thought I would take 5 minutes just to summarize the arguments here. Before I do, Michael, what time did I start speaking so I know that I'll finish on time? 3 minutes. Thank you. Power transition, most of you know, assumes that rising powers have a strong desire to go to war and defeat the dominant power in the system so they can remake the international order to suit their own needs and interests. Alternatively, it's theorized by some that the dominant powers, recognizing this, go to war against rising powers while they can still win to prevent this from happening. What we find in our data set of all wars involving great and rising powers on one side or another from 1648 until the present is that there are no wars of power transition. It's an utter fiction. And when power transitions take place, they are the result of wars rather than the causes for them. In the data set, we have only 2 examples of rising and great powers going to war with one another. The one in recent history is the Korean War, where China and the US fought a limited war. But that war cannot in any way be explained as a war of power transition. What happens historically is that the 2 most violent states are indeed dominant powers and rising powers, but for quite different reasons. Dominant powers succumb to hubris and seek hegemony. From Philip II of Spain through Louis XIV, Napoleon, Germany, we have examples of these states starting wars in the hope of achieving hegemonies. They tend to attack small powers or once declining great powers. Rising powers, historically, above all, want admission to the club of great powers. And if you want admission to the club, it's not a wise strategy to throw rocks through the window of the president's home. So, in effect, rising powers also tend to attack smaller states or once declining great powers. Almost every rising power has gone to war against Spain, the Ottoman Empire, both of which were declining powers, or in the case of Japan, China in the Far East. It's a very different pattern than power transition suggests. Most importantly, with regard to rising powers, the great powers have sought not to exclude rising powers from the system, but to include them. So it's been a mutual relationship of renegotiation of the existing system. And for these reasons, most rising powers have accommodated themselves quite successfully. You may remember Cohen and others believing in these kinds of illusory theories, thinking it anomalous that Germany and Japan, rather than challenging the existing system when they became rising powers, sought to become major supporters of it. The argument that power transition and after hegemony rest on is that somehow the dominant power gets most of the advantages from the system. In effect, international orders are negotiated, not imposed. And negotiated orders require that all kinds of other actors derive benefits from the system, or they would not sign on to it. And from the perspective of Germany and Japan, and presumably of the BRICS as well, this is well understood. And what they want are the benefits of the existing system, with perhaps some changes specific to their own needs. And therefore, the dominant point of my paper is that it is possibly a tragedy in the making that so many Western and specifically American analysts use power transition as the lens to examine China's rise to power. It has the potential to make their fear of conflict self-fulfilling and has no historical and analytical support as a tool for analysis. Now, part of my argument rests on the notion that while there is sometimes a dominant power, that dominant power is far from a hegemon. And when we turn to the United States, there is more evidence for this, and I lay all this out in my papers, so I won't recoup it here. In the economic sphere, the United States, rather than being a principal bulwark of economic order, is a free rider, the world's largest debtor nation that behaves in ways that are not conducive of supporting the economic system. Arguably, in the political sphere, the United States has behaved in a number of unilateral ways. One need only think of Iraq as the most extreme example of this, which have led to a tremendous decline in its standing and its effectiveness, and have created the seeming paradox that the world's most powerful state is less and less and less able to persuade others to do what it wants. And in effect, what my co-author Simon Reich do in this paper is to argue that the conditions associated with maintaining hegemony have diffused through the international system, and that different players, great and small, participate or pick up pieces of this, the ones that suit their interest and capabilities, and that this kind of system has the potential to be far more effective than hegemony. And in the case of the United States, it's essential that it recognize the changed nature of the world and the fact that its claims about hegemony and its necessity are utter illusion. Thank you.
Essentially to the whole theme, I mean, questioning the category of hegemony as such, and questioning, of course, also the guidance through this concept for American foreign policy. Closer?
The mic is dead.
Oh, is it dead? I'll try this one. Oh, this is much better. I summarized myself. I said thank you to Ned for this very great introduction. And we move on with watching on the time, and this is to Karen Smith, who brings in a perspective from South Africa. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again just to the organizers for organizing what is a very impressive conference. And again, just thanks to all the effort that was put in getting all of us here at the same time. I think that's to be commended. Just on a side note, before I start, I was just thinking about the minister's statistics that he put up about happiness. And I was just in Denmark last week, and I can promise you that South Africans are much happier than Danes. So I don't know where those statistics come from. Originally, the title of my paper was African Perspective on World Order, and I thought that was a bit presumptuous, so I've changed it to An African Perspective on World Order. In other words, my perspective on world order. However, as you know, South Africa likes to portray itself as the spokesperson for Africa in various fora, so it's perhaps not inappropriate for me to present the African view on world order here today. So if we look at the growing literature on changing world order, future world order, most discussions you find are preoccupied with two things. One is anxiety about the future role of the United States, and the second is the unpredictability of China's agenda. So, while we see some attention being paid to Europe, also, of course, Brazil, India, the rest of the world is largely overlooked, and Africa in particular is either ignored entirely or awarded a brief mention. And this, of course, continues a long-standing convention in the study of international relations, in which Africa is largely marginalized and regarded as a part of the world which is acted upon on rather than having any agency in world affairs. I think it's important that Africa be included in this discussion, and I'm happy that it has been included in a number of ways in this conference, because we live in a world order where Africa is still acts as the most striking symbol of inequality. And I think the drive for a more equal world order will necessarily entail a shift in the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. Just a general note on thinking about future world orders, I think we should focus not only on what kind of world order we want or that might come about, but also whose world order. And of course, Charles Kupchan has his own answer to that particular question. Similarly, I think instead of limiting ourselves to discussions around balance of power scenarios, is it a multipolar world, is it a non-polar world, we should also be asking about the substance of such a world order. In other words, besides the structural aspects, we should also be exploring the qualitative ones. In the first part of my paper, I looked briefly at different understandings of the concept of world order, because some of them are more descriptive, some are more normative, but that's also a slippery slope between them. But I'm going to skip that because I only have 15 minutes. So I'm going to go straight into what I regard as some African concerns with world order. And of course, I have to justify that at the outset. There is no single coherent African conception of world order. As you know, Africa is a continent of 54 independent states. And although they do share some commonalities in perspective, they are marked by tremendous diversity and don't always agree on even basic principles of global governance and order. At the same time, I think it is possible to identify some similarities. So firstly, of course, African states, I think in general, still largely view the world through anti-colonial lenses and regard the current world order as a Western imposed one. There's also consensus that the current world order is unjust on various levels. It's characterized by exclusionary economic practices and founded on undemocratic and illegitimate institutions of global governance that serve to marginalize the majority of the world's population. There's also agreement that the global economic system needs to be reformed and that international organizations need to be more representative and responsive to the needs of Africa. Most Africans, I think, are unlikely to agree with John Eikenberry, who unfortunately is not attending the conference, that, I quote, "the current order is arguably the most successful international order the world has yet seen in terms of wealth creation, physical security, and hope for justice." That's perhaps true for the citizens of the North, but for the majority of the world's population, including Africans, I think the current world order has been marked by conflict, inequality, poverty, and human suffering of the worst kind. Now, when I was trying to think about how to approach this topic and how to do it in a more coherent way, how Africa experiences the current world order, what it may want from a future world order, I found Robert Cox's triangular framework that allows us to consider the interplay between material forces, ideas, and institutions to be quite a useful way of looking at how these different factors work together in creating, maintaining, and also potentially transforming world order. So if I start off taking the lead from Achille Mbembe, who's an African scholar, he points out that Africa is very much a materialist continent, historically so, but even more so today. So I want to start briefly by looking at the implications of the material aspects of world order on Africa. As you know, over centuries, the rest of the world has exploited Africa for its material riches. Today, again, we see this happening. Africa is providing much of the primary resources that fuel the forces of production in the emerging powers like China, India, and of course Brazil. And the current world order is underpinned by a global capitalist system. Although the globalized system is marked by greater interdependence, it's clear that certain regions, in Africa in particular, have been and remain more vulnerable and more constrained by the forces of world order than other parts of the world. Historically and today, Africa has been marked by deeper forms of structural dependency and has been affected negatively by uneven globalization. In other words, in a world based on economic power, and I think worryingly we see the emerging powers focusing much more on their economic power than anything else as well, the poorest regions of the world are effectively disenfranchised. They're forced to participate in a global order, even though it generally does not reflect their interests and they have no power to change it. This relates to another African scholar, Claude Arkie's argument that an order in which the majority of members have no stake and see no justice is ultimately unviable. Turning briefly to institutions, as we know, institutionalization has been a central aspect of the post-1945 order, and global institutions have been crucial in upholding the current order and preventing change. So from an African perspective, it's especially important to explore the role of global institutions in the reproduction of an unequal world system. It must, however, also be noted that, of course, African states are active participants in global institutions, which they have used, amongst others, as fora to build coalitions against stronger states and to promote new ideas and norms. So one can think of anti-colonialism as an example. Not only, of course, have African states and other developing states joined existing Western institutions, they've also created their own. The non-aligned movement, the G77, and more recently, more informal groupings like the India-Brazil, South Africa Dialogue Forum. Africa has also placed strong emphasis on regional organizations, and much effort has gone into strengthening the African Union, its capacity for action across a number of areas, but particularly I think of interest is in the peace and security area. African states thus generally view global institutions as important, particularly the UN system. They see them as vehicles to advance their own interests, and so they don't want to undermine the global multilateral system, but they would like to see a more equitable distribution of power in existing institutions. And here I want to make a few points. How many minutes have I got left, Michael? 5, okay. I just want to say a few brief things about South Africa. I know Adam Habib's paper is going to deal more in detail with this, but I think it's important to just point out South Africa's particular views on world order, because of course South Africa is quite loud in terms of calling for reform of the current world order, especially in terms of making institutions of global governance more representative. At the same time, it's also a staunch defender of principles of multilateralism, sovereignty, and non-intervention, principles on which arguably the existing system is built. Of course, its calls for reform are largely a response to what it views as contraventions of the existing rules of the game on the basis of unilateralist action, especially by the United States. So its calls for a new or reformed world order, it's not so much based on a call for new rules of the game and new principles, but rather a new order in which there's greater adherence to and respect for the existing rules on which the system is built. Moving on to ideas. So beyond institutions, ideas, of course, have been instrumental in the rise and consolidation of the current world order. And the neoliberal-inspired market-led development doctrine that is an integral part of the current order has perhaps affected Africa most directly. The impact of these ideas has not only been felt in the economy, but has really informed all aspects of African life. And there's been much talk about the fact that while China's economic power is on the rise, this is not accompanied by the spread of Chinese ideology or values. But I think China and other emerging powers are promoting new ideas of development and modernization and presenting African states with alternative models. Africa has embraced certain elements of the existing world order and has in fact become a champion of some, notably sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. On the other hand, African states are skeptical of new norms such as the responsibility to protect, and they're critical of the way in which some Western states, particularly the USA, have undermined their own liberal ideas through, amongst others, a disregard for international law and trade restrictions. At the same time, African states, while officially adopting some aspects of the Western order, often do so very superficially. This includes adopting democracy in form, but not in substance, or the adoption of international human rights standards for largely instrumentalist or pragmatic reasons. So the last point I want to make about ideas and institutions is while African states have generally been regarded as rule takers rather than rule makers, there are some examples of African states playing the role of norm entrepreneurs and norm leaders, and I don't have time to go into that, but I just wanted to mention that. So moving towards the conclusion, looking at alternative forms of world order, what would Africa like to see from a future world order? Well, again, while there's no unified notion of what a new world order should entail, there seems to be one consistent message coming from Africa, that a new world order should entail a better world for more people and particularly a more equitable distribution of wealth. This relates to a distinction that Georg Sorensen draws between world orders of the past, which he claims were mainly about creating a stable balance of power to ensure peace and security, and contemporary demands for world order. He argues that today, aspirations for world order have expanded to include a variety of other values, with socioeconomic ones, well-being being particularly important from an African point of view. So overall, one can say that Africa's expectations of world order are quite high. The continent's understanding of world order is an explicitly normative one that demands not only global stability, but also demands that a new order should deliver economic benefits to the continent. In addition, African states are broadly supportive of the Chinese notion of coexistence, which one could say is an alternative view of world order, interpreted as a kind of live and let live approach, where state sovereignty is respected, states are allowed to determine their own political systems and development trajectories without fear of being punished for not following the criteria set by the USA and the West in general. So finally, in conclusion, if I have another 2 minutes or minutes, okay, we're currently in a period where existing knowledge structures are being unsettled, so I think it's very exciting, especially for students working in this field at the moment, and where we're really presented with an opportunity to imagine, and I want to focus on this word imagine, alternatives to the current world order. An American scholar, Anthony Bogues, argues that at the heart of the neoliberal project is an attempt to capture the imagination of people and convince them that no other life is desirable or even possible. So I think imagining a different world order is challenging, but it's very important. And a good starting point would be the lived experiences of ordinary people. For centuries, Western ideas and institutions have determined the nature of world orders. And I think now that the material power is shifting, perhaps it's time that we start drawing on ideas from outside of the West as well. So I also want to just make another point about Eichenberry's premise that emerging states will simply be co-opted into the liberal order. I think it seems more likely that we will see a re-articulation or a reinterpretation of the liberal order by non-Western states, rather than simply a wholesale acceptance of it. Finally, when thinking about future world orders, it's useful to keep in mind that order is not neutral. It works to the advantage of some people and to the disadvantage of others. This brings us back to the point made earlier that our discussion should not only focus on what kind of world order, but also whose world order. And while debates about world orders will endure, I'm sure, for a while to come, and despite optimistic predictions about the rise of Africa, one thing is for certain, the next world order is unlikely to be Africa's. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. I mean, just to defend the Danes for a moment, this book of 1995 of Zürn and Tom, the official title is Whose World Order, but internally we also labeled it, we always label it Whose World Order in order to get the Danish tone in it. So there is a certain sense of fun also in Denmark. I pass on to Paulo. He is talking about the BRICS effect, multilateralism, and its discontinuity.
Thanks, Michael. I will certainly give a hard time to the table, to the discussants, because I didn't deliver the paper in time. I have, and probably because of my English, I have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation to help to understand this still quite confusing argument, I guess. This presentation is, the paper is being written from some, let's say, perplexities or some uneasiness that I guess all of us have regarding BRICS. We were joking before, I don't know anybody who can actually define what BRICS is about. And also for the Brazilians, and I guess perhaps for most of South Africans, we have no idea what Brazil and South Africa is doing there, why we are taking part in this kind of thing. It's a question that comes all the time, again and again. And I'm certainly not intending to ask those questions, but at least to formulate them in a better way, to try to formulate this uneasiness about BRICS and about the relationship between BRICS and multilateral institutions and the world order in a better way. So I prepared a presentation divided in 4 topics. The first one is an attempt to, which was made by several of the participants in this colloquium. I guess the last one was made by Miles Collar, who actually tried to summarize positions around emerging powers, around rising powers in an issue published this year. So I will try to at least to identify two different positions toward two different interpretations or understandings about BRICS in this first section, in which I discuss, which I'm naming narrating the BRICS. The second section tries to discuss the relationship between BRICS and multilateralism and why multilateralism is important to BRICS. The third one, I will try to develop a notion, I'm not daring to call that a concept, but a notion of a BRICS effect. And in the fourth section, I will try to raise some questions about what can happen with multilateralism within BRICS and within the global south. It is possible to identify two different positions toward BRICS. A first position assumes that the international system is still a unipolar system, that multilateral institutions are actually an effect of this distribution of power within the international system, and hegemony is still in place, orienting the content in the form of these institutions. These institutions were created to solve problems. I'm talking about the neoliberal institutionalism here. These institutions were created to solve problems related to market failures and to facilitate the provision of public goods, as everybody knows. And to this particular perspective, BRICS are not able to compete or to challenge the unipolar system and therefore the multilateral institutions, and they will have at some point to accommodate themselves, or they are already accommodated within the international, in the multilateral arena. So in that sense, I guess this is the main defender, main supporter of this position is exactly Ikenberry. For this kind of understanding, the only way to BRICS countries will be to be accommodated within this order is actually because of the costs of challenging these orders would be too high to them. And the BRICS groups, because of the amount of, because of the disagreements between the countries, and also because of the polar positions towards some crucial issues like the Security Council reform, the WTO Doha meeting, and so on and so forth. The BRICS group is actually quite irrelevant in terms of changing or challenging the multilateral system. The second position assumes that the international system has changed or is in the way of changing from the unipolar world to the multipolar world. This is a quite common position, especially in the South, and especially by decision makers trying to justify their foreign policies in countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, or in the BRICS countries, if you will. But also is a common position, it's a common, more paranoid position in the North, trying to raise the fear of challenging the multilateral institutions, of the challenge to the multilateral institutions, and also about the costs of supporting, of maintaining this multilateral order, which are not being paid by BRICS countries, for instance, or emerging countries. This is the free riding aspect of the problem. So multilateral institutions to that particular, in that particular interpretation becomes a central problem since from the point of view of the South, it is a matter of justice, of fairness, to change the multilateral system in order to include not only the emerging powers, but since the emerging power claims to represent the Global South itself should be included in the multilateral institutions. So the main question is about the distributional effects of multilateral institutions. So they have to be changed exactly because they produce and reproduce inequalities within the international system. I guess Karin tackled this point, this exactly point. For the North, for the Northern narratives, what we have is a concern about emerging powers free riding in multilateral institutions. So in terms of security, climate change, and even trade, the emerging powers or rising countries was supposed to pay or to contribute to the provision of such public goods, and they are not doing that, claiming that they are still developing countries. So from that particular perspective, the relationship between BRICS and multilateralism is a relationship of challenge. From the southern version of it, it's a challenge for fairness. From the northern version of it, is a challenge to make these rising powers actually pay to sustain the multilateral institutions, and for the southern countries to still not paying to take part in this particular order. The BRICS group acquires, at least in the southern version of this particular narration, acquires a strategic meaning, detrimental to the world order and also to BRICS countries. The apocalypse version of it assumes that the world order will change and the BRICS will challenge the multilateral institutions, and the BRICS countries play a really central role in doing so. Another one, please. So, what I'm trying to do in this second section, actually, after trying to sum up this literature in these terms, is going back to the concept of multilateralism and try to understand why this concept is actually important, or important for BRICS, for emerging powers, and for southern countries. So we have at least two main concepts. The first one is the neoliberal concept of multilateral institutions. It's a Bob Cohen concept well known by everybody. And the second one is John Ruggie's concept, which adds a qualitative, as he says, element to the former one. Regarding the neoliberal institutionalist concept of multilateral institutions, the dimension which is missing in this concept is the fact that prior to the bargain within institutions and to create institutions, public choice theorists, they say to us that that should be a constitutional choice period in which the basic framework of the game will be played. So things like property rights, they are not a given, they are not natural, they are actually negotiating this kind of a moment, and they should be tackled or at least should be addressed when we think about multilateral institutions. So my point here is that many perspectives on multilateralism just assume that a given constitutional framework is actually international. A particular constitutional framework should be or is actually universal. So it assumes things like property rights, intellectual property rights. Are they private? Should we have intellectual property rights? That is something that is assumed by some actors that actually sustain multilateral institutions, but it is actually a really heavy political debate, especially for countries from the South. That kind of choice is very often neglected or ignored by this particular approach. The second approach deals with the idea of a given social purpose, to use Huggy's expression, which is internationalized and embedded in international multilateral institutions. The question we can address to this particular approach, I guess Acharya did that in a chapter on multilateralism, is how these principles are played in history over time by actors, how the actors are actually socialized within these principles, within this normative framework, and they can change this framework. So the question we could ask here is how these principles are played by ordinary actors and how can they change? So because of that, I have to go fast here. Because of that, I'm proposing to take multilateralism, following Acharya in that sense, as a processual and as a process and as a relational social setting. And as a social setting, multilateralism allows the emergence of specific understandings about time and space. It is important to remind that for most of BRICS countries, I have always a hard time to figure Russia inside this group, but for most of the BRICS countries, multilateralism was a way of self-assertion during the Cold War. For most of these countries, the idea of self-determination, the idea of non-intervention, the norms on non-intervention and self-determination were actually crucial to their presence and their participation within the international system. As they were actually crucial for their very existence as not good citizens, but at least as citizens within the international system. And if we remind at that point in time that those norms were being negotiated, we can think that the very ideas of time and space were negotiated at the same time. So if we think about sovereignty as a territorial way to organize space that took place after the Second World War, after the end of the imperial rule all over the world, we are going to see that space was understood in a given way. And also, time was understood in a given way. If we think that the development regime arose at that point in time, we will see that the world was actually divided between developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And this division was based on time, on a specific idea about time and its relation to space. So the very idea about this divide between North and South was actually negotiated within this multilateral framework that emerged from the Second World War. So if BRICS are actually really articulated by this multilateral order, they were re-articulated and they played with norms also after the Cold War. And if we think that after the Cold War, a new liberal order actually changed a lot the main multilateral institutions in terms of security, in terms of trade, in terms of development, we think that all these BRICS countries or these emerging countries, in a way, they were actually subjected to these multilateral institutions. So if we think about a new liberal order, we are thinking about a transformative agenda in which security is understood in a very different way as a consequence, not any longer of the balance of power, but mostly about the spread of democracy, for instance. And since security is given by the spread of democracy, is assured by the spread of democracy, all the countries should, in a way, be transformed. This is exactly what I'm calling it a transformative agenda, should be transformed in a liberal, democratic way to assure security, to assure that the market gain a global reach instead of an international reach. And development was actually oriented to produce these kind of transformations towards market and towards democracy. So the idea of the security, I'm trying to conclude, the idea of the security development nexus is exactly a way to assure that peace will be provided, but peace will be provided by the transformation of the countries all around the world. To conclude this, what I'm calling BRICS effect is exactly the moment in which this new liberal revolution, if we want to use Martin White's concept, this new liberal revolution that has changed a lot multilateral institutions and multilateral norms, this revolution is paralyzed now. And it is paralyzed for many, many, many reasons. The unwillingness of the United States to pursue or to lead this neoliberal revolution to the 2008-2009 economic crisis, but also because of what I'm calling here the BRICS effect. What the BRICS provide, although it's very difficult to define what BRICS is about, and although it's very difficult to understand what the countries are doing inside this particular group, the effect that BRICS have or the group of BRICS have to multilateral institutions is the centerment or the centering movement that questions the universal claims of the new liberal order. It is hard to think that BRICS will do much more than create deadlocks or to stop the advancement of the new liberal order. But, and that's the last, sorry about that. It is hard to think that they can go beyond this highly negative agenda, but this particular effect, raised some questions that I do think are important in this context. First, although BRICS paralyzed or contribute to the paralysis of multilateral institutions, do they have a common alternative to new liberal norms? The answer here is probably no. There is no consensus among BRICS, among the group, and even if you think that the Beijing consensus would be an alternative to the Washington consensus, this is highly improbable. The second question is, how about the asymmetries within the BRICS group? The main argument here is that if the BRICS produces paralysis in multilateral institutions, the multilateral institutions would not favor any longer some of the BRICS countries. So countries like Brazil, South Africa, and perhaps even China, even India, will be damaged or will be hurt by the failure or by the paralysis of multilateral institutions, because they depend more on that institutions than China, for instance. And the third one, there is no promise that we'll have a more just or more fair world. in that sense, how BRICS contribute, in what direction BRICS are contributing to re-edit or recreate the divide between center and periphery, the divide between north and south, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. I hope the length of the contribution does not correlate with the population. In spite of the fact that Brazil is a large country, it would create problems if we have now Sumit Ganguly from Indiana University with his writing about India in the liberal world order.
At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for their extraordinarily generous hospitality. My presentation is about India in the global liberal order, and I am talking explicitly about political liberalism, not economic liberalism, and I wanted to make that clear at the outset. The paper is divided, at least my presentation is divided into 5 distinct sections. First, I'll briefly talk about why India should be a supporter of global liberal norms. Then I'll talk about early motivations which inhibited India from supporting some of these norms, and certain departures also on particular occasions. Then I'll talk about the transition that India faced at the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War came as the end of the Cold War came as a significant exogenous shock to Indian foreign policy makers. Fourth, I will talk about 3 distinct arenas where India has expressed some ambivalence about global liberalism. And finally, I will conclude this presentation with some thoughts about the future. At the very outset, it would seem that a host of attributes should make India a staunch supporter of a global liberal order. Despite seemingly insurmountable odds, it made a rather swift transition to democracy and was an early supporter of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At home, it adopted a largely liberal democratic constitution in 1950, and barring a very brief interregnum of authoritarian rule between 1976 and 77, it has managed to sustain democracy. And it has also deepened and broadened the scope of its democracy, though its record, quite frankly, is hardly unblemished. Yet, since the days of its first prime minister, the country has been ambivalent about support for liberal democratic principles and institutions abroad. What explains this? In considerable part, the motivations were understandable and have been alluded to in part by a couple of other panelists. It stemmed largely from the fact, from 3 or 4 distinct factors. First, as a state that had just shed the yoke of colonial rule, it was extremely keen and on jealously guarding the nascent sovereignty that it had obtained after having thrown off British colonial rule. More to the point, given that both the United States and the Soviet Union were not reticent about intervening abroad to bolster and secure their interests, the adoption of this unyielding stance on the issue of sovereignty was quite understandable on India's part in the early Cold War era. At the end of the Cold War, there was a substantial shock to India's policymakers, which required a dramatic reappraisal of India's foreign policy assumptions. In the aftermath of Nehru's death, his successors, most notably Indira Gandhi, while maintaining the ideational rhetoric that had characterized India's foreign policy, had increasingly adopted a much more pragmatic approach to foreign policy, even though it was couched in the language of an ideational approach to foreign policy. Though increasingly India had started to behave like a state much more concerned about protecting what it deemed to be its critical national interests, while mouthing sort of the language of another era. In the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, and particularly the first Gulf War, India's policymakers concluded that they could ill afford to simply fall back on certain nostrums that had guided Indian foreign policy during the Cold War. As a consequence, a vigorous domestic debate ensued. Some within the Indian policymaking establishment insisted that India should not abandon its historic commitment to non-alignment, but should infuse it with new meaning, though they couldn't quite come up with what new meaning they should infuse it with, other than coming up with shibboleths like strategic autonomy. Who wouldn't want strategic autonomy? I can't imagine a country saying that, you know, we really would like strategic dependence. So the notion of strategic autonomy is not a terribly helpful guiding principle. Other than states which are really bereft of choices and must depend upon larger states in the international order, it's hard to imagine a country of, you know, almost a civilizational country saying that, no, we really would like strategic dependence. Others, however, suggested that a more pragmatic approach to the global order was necessary, and that non-alignment really was now bereft of all meaning. Which really now takes me to the fourth theme, which is the three critical areas that emerged where India expressed considerable ambivalence. And the three areas are the responsibility to protect, the question of democracy promotion, and the issue of the International Criminal Court. Let me start with the responsibility to protect. I need not explain what that concept is to this audience, but I'll turn directly to India's key reservations. From the outset, Indian policymakers expressed their reservations about granting the Security Council the requisite authority to permit humanitarian intervention. It asserted that such authority would undermine state sovereignty under the expectations of the UN Charter, but would also render the rest of the UN membership powerless to disagree. Furthermore, in the same vein, they argued that the proper authority really lay with the United Nations General Assembly. What about the International Criminal Court? In the case of the ICC, India expressed a number of reservations. What were the reservations? The key reservation was that when this, that it said that it expressed reservations that there was the opt-in provision was not included in the statute that created the court and granted it inherent jurisdiction, and thereby India felt compelled to abstain. Its decision really stemmed from three real concerns, and I'll spell those out very clearly. First, it had to do with the capacity of the Indian judicial system to respond quickly to mete out condign punishment in a speedy and prompt fashion. The Indian judicial system is one of the most backlogged judicial systems anywhere in the world. I will not entertain you with the figures, but it's actually mind-boggling. The second, it stemmed from the awareness of the inability of its prosecutorial and judicial systems to bring to task egregious violators of human rights at home, especially in the face of state complicity. For example, as one commentator has written in the aftermath of what is widely seen as a pogrom in the western state of Gujarat in February 2002, and to quote, "It is only the proximate and direct perpetrators who in the few cases that survive are being tried. The chain of command, complicity and connivance remain beyond the pale." Finally, the Indian state feared that the ICC would be subject to political bias and thereby place India and other vulnerable states in the dock while overlooking the malfeasances of others. All of these concerns suggest a lack of faith in the robustness of its own judicial institutions and their capacity to respond to the most blatant violations of human rights within the country. Given that regimes of every ideological stripe within the past 3 decades have been implicated in substantial human rights violations during their own terms in office, and that the judiciary has been unable to bring those responsible to account for their actions, it is most unlikely that India will demonstrate any particular willingness to shift its position on the ICC. Let me turn to the issue of democracy promotion. Despite a clear commitment to the preservation of democracy at home, India's policymakers have been mostly loath to promote democracy abroad. Again, 3 factors explain India's unwillingness to take up the cudgel of democracy promotion. In considerable part, it stems from its aversion to serve as a democracy monger, or in considerable part, its aversion to serve as a democracy monger stems from a deeply rooted aversion to both colonialism and imperialism located in India's political culture. Even 60 years after the end of British rule, the memories of colonial and post-colonial rationalizations for foreign interventions remain very much alive. Of course, in a related vein, they meaning Indian policymakers, remain acutely cognizant of the infirmities of their own domestic institutions and want to fend off possible external pressures and inordinate scrutiny of various domestic shortcomings. Finally, their hesitation also stems from their location in a deeply troubled neighborhood, which is host to a number of authoritarian regimes capable of deploying varying levels of repression and brutality. This finally brings me to my conclusion. The foregoing analysis shows that in three key emergent pillars of the global liberal order, India's response has been both limited and tentative. The limitations stem in considerable part from its colonial legacies, its institutional weaknesses, the exigencies of domestic politics, and the constraints of existing material capabilities. The central question that lies before us, and from this, that stems from this analysis, is whether or not India might prove more willing to act differently and assume a greater responsibility to provide various global public goods if it manages to bolster its domestic capabilities, to steadily shed its colonial hangover, and succeed in addressing its various domestic institutional constraints. Thus far, India, unlike during the Nehruvian era, has failed to spell out an alternative set of global norms and institutional arrangements, even as it has proven to be highly critical of key emergent liberal principles. Might an economically resurgent India that manages to improve the efficacy of its domestic institutions, that manages to shed its post-colonial anxieties, and thereby finds itself on a more secure footing, act differently in the international arena? Despite its current economic difficulties, much of which can be traced to poor policy choices and the shortcomings of its institutional capacities, there is no reason to wholly write off India's possible rise. Whether or not, with renewed economic growth and improved institutional performance, India's policymakers will change their stances and assume the requisite burdens to help provide key global public goods that could contribute to the creation of a more liberal global order remains an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move on and we come to the discussion. I think this one does not work anymore, so I'll give you this one. We originally had the plan that you try to limit yourself also to 15 minutes. In spite of the big task.
I will do my best. I will make some comments on the papers under the understanding that the organizers want this to be a publication rather than just treating each of them individually, because I think that may in fact be most useful to those people who are writing the papers. I think that the Ned Lebow paper is meant to be a scene setter. I assume it would either be the first chapter or an early chapter in this, and so let me offer some thoughts on how to push it in the direction of perhaps identifying more clearly some of the key issues that are raised in the substantive chapters that would follow. First, I think, Ned, that I would like to see a little bit more analytic clarity in the first part of the paper about how you define hegemony, where and how you distinguish between the material aspects and the non-material, the practice and the normative aspects of hegemony, because I found the analysis a little bit slippery in terms of your argument that hegemony ended decades ago. That, to some extent, flies in the face of the conventional wisdom, as you rightly say, but I'd like to see a little bit more evidence to back that up. And you offer examples of the United States not getting its way, of countries pushing back against the U.S., disagreeing with the U.S., but that's kind of business as usual within international politics. And when you look at the distribution of material power, the U.S. and its allies representing 75% of global GDP, the United States today spending more on the rest of the world combined on defense spending, I think you need to go a little bit further in making your case that hegemony is not only over, but that it's been over for quite a long time, especially when the 1990s were seen as the kind of highlight, the high point of American hegemony after the Soviet Union collapsed. But I think that in some ways, the supposition of the volume is one that rests quite comfortably with your paper, because this is a conference and a volume and a discussion about what's next. And so I'm really just trying to help you cover some of your flanks and not get engaged in some debates that you don't need to, given that the supposition of this is American hegemony is in the midst of waning, and we need to have a global conversation about what's going to take its place. In that respect, I think the volume and the analytic contribution that is, and the empirical contribution that looms is really less about where we are in the global distribution of power and much more about issues of practice and norms. And so I think you might want to play those issues up in this chapter, assuming that it ends up being an introductory one in a couple of different respects. One, on the practice front, and you do this to a limited degree, but say a little bit more about the changing brand of internationalism in the United States, the sequester, the looming no vote on intervention in Syria, the fact that the United States is no longer ready to be the provider of last resort because of its own internal economic problems. And so even though in a material sense, the U.S. is still 25% of global wealth, or 23, 24, still has a huge military, in terms of how it uses that power, I think we are entering an important period of change. And then the other issue would be to set up the chapters that follow by saying a little bit more about where the norms that instantiate order come from, because I think that is in many respects what these other three papers are really getting at. In terms of sort of perhaps laying out an analytic framework, I think four hypotheses come to mind. One is that, and this would be the Eikenberry view, that norms are highly functional and that they are kind of designed behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance to produce the best utilitarian outcome. Secondly would be that norms bubble up from below. They are culturally determined. And here one would look at American exceptionalism. In the South African case, the concept of Ubuntu, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, but that different powers bring to the table very different norms about domestic and international governance that are rooted in history and their individual cultural, socioeconomic, historical trajectories. A third would be that you can say a lot about the norms that a country wants to push out by where it is in the power trajectory and in its own domestic development. This comes out particularly in Sumit's paper, where he says, if there were more domestic confidence, if India were further along, then its norms about sovereignty, about ICC, about democracy promotion would change. And then finally, there's the hypothesis, quite popular in the United States, I happen to think it's a bunch of bahooey, that regime type is a good predictor of normative perspective. That is to say, democracies want these kinds of norms, non-democracies want these kinds of norms, and therefore the next order is going to be defined by this kind of Fukuyama-esque clash between a democratic normative order and a non-democratic normative order. Anyway, I think that it would be helpful to kind of at least have a section along those lines in the first paper. Let me now just say a few things about the individual papers. And here I think these papers are doing exactly what they should do, in which, and I think the conversation and the research about this issue of change in the global system, multipolarity, BRICS, developed countries, has been too theoretical, if you will, and to some extent too ideological and too rhetorical, and has lacked hard empirical research. And I think these papers have really begun to do that. And I would encourage others to sort of get a fine-grained analysis to say, well, what does India think about the ICC? What does it think about democracy promotion? What does it think about sovereignty and the responsibility to protect? And so I think these papers are really quite instructive in getting down, rolling up the sleeves and saying, here is what an emerging, developing BRIC country has to say about these norms. And it's very helpful that on these fundamental dimensions, when the rubber meets the road, a liberal, democratic, emerging power called India doesn't share the defining fundamental positions of the current liberal order. That's extremely important. And I think that I'd like to see Sumit go a little bit further in trying to identify where he thinks those different norms come from. And I get the sense in your paper that you do believe that they have a good bit to do with where India is in its power trajectory. I'm not so sure. I think it may also have to do with deeper norms that are passed along generationally through a certain political narrative about colonialism, which leads me to be somewhat skeptical that if India were further along, it would be more interested in democracy promotion. It may be that emerging powers are less comfortable with the whole idea of international paternalism. That is to say, a small group of powerful countries telling the rest of the world how they should behave. And I'm not sure that if India or China or Brazil were further along in the pecking order, that those kinds of norms would change. But I'd like to see you engage that issue. Same kind of questions for Karen. You focus a little bit more on issues of global justice and equity than Sumit does. I'd like to see your two papers talk to each other a little bit more, because India has these issues in spades, right? A very unequal country, a kind of path of development that has not been as successful as China in creating a substantial middle class. And so it'd be interesting to hear views that percolate up in India about global justice, about economic inequality. And in that respect, I think it would be interesting, I don't know if your paper should do this, but to perhaps pick up on this issue of inequality and equity in some of the other papers, because in my country, this is now a political issue. And it has not been really since the United States became a major global power, that is to say, since Pearl Harbor. We now have conversations on a daily basis in the United States about inequality, about the 1%, about why the United States is the most unequal country in the industrialized world. And that may mean that this is a narrative that could play an important role in thinking about new norms of global governance and in getting the United States to buy into some of the concerns that BRICS countries have, that is to say, in terms of forging some kind of broader consensus. Also, Karen, I thought that you should develop a little bit more this issue of China and its presence in Africa and what that means for alternative visions of development that may now be in play that weren't before. Because there was a conception, this sort of Eikenberry view of the world, that there's really one path of modernity. And everybody's going to get on that road and drive at different speeds, but it's the same destination, right? I don't agree with that, but I'd like to see you sort of talk about when Africans look out at the world and see different models of development and which roads they can take, are they now looking at China and saying, hey, that's not such a bad model? Either because of its success, or because, unlike the United States, which arrives with its aid package and says you need to do X, Y, and Z and have multi-party elections and have transparency and accountability, China says, here I am, I'm ready to build a bridge, where and when do I start? And this gets at the whole question of the relationship between power and ideas. Just a couple quick comments. You know, I think your paper gets at the heart at some of the normative issues from a more abstract and theoretical level, whereas Karen and Sumit are doing it at the empirical and the fine grain level. So I think the papers work together very nicely. Couple of things you might want to play out a little bit more. One is, I like a lot this whole idea of what is the purpose and role of multilateral institutions, because for the United States, for the West, they are seen as the tentacles that are reaching out to include the emerging powers in the existing liberal order. Whereas I think emerging powers see these institutions as sites of contestation, right, where they can engage Western powers and push norms in their direction. And I think it's important to underscore that multilateralism, that institutions themselves are actually seen in very different ways by countries that are in different positions. Second, I find it, you know, very useful to get at this whole question of, are norms universal or particularistic? And might we be moving into a world in which the whole idea of a system of global governance predicated upon a set of shared norms, that may be over, right? And in that sense, we may be moving to a world that for the first time in history will be globalized and interdependent, but without a core set of anchoring norms, which means we're heading to something that's much more regionalized and much more pluralistic. And then finally, you know, I think you raise an important question, sort of buttresses the last point, that there isn't a consensus in the BRICS. The BRICS have spent a lot of time saying, don't do this, don't do that, we don't like that. But it's time to create an agenda that is more proactive rather than reactive. It's time to have a conversation that's not just about, we don't like this norm, we don't think you should do that, to a conversation where the BRICS are actually stepping up to the plate. And they're saying there is a gap between the demand for global governance and the supply of global governance. Here's what we're going to do to fill that gap. Here's where we're going to send peacekeepers. Here's the new development bank where we're going to loan money to countries that need it. And I think that kind of hands-on discussion about the delivery of public goods may in fact push this debate more forward in a much more constructive way than a more kind of ethereal, distant, esoteric discussion about norms that exist in a political vacuum.
Thank you very much. I think these were very constructive and helpful comments. We have now 35 minutes left, and that means essentially that I would suggest a deal to you, to the paper givers, that you get now 2 to 3 minutes to answer the issues brought up by Charles. And if you stay within those 2 or 3 minutes, each of you, then we have 10 or 15 minutes for a round of questions from you, and then you in turn get back the word at the end. If you go over those 3 minutes, you don't get back the word at the end. So, I mean, that's the kind of contract that I suggest here. Having said that, I mean, we maybe stay in order and give the word first to Ned again.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Charles, for thoughtful comments on my contribution and indeed on everyone else's. Much of what you would like to see in my paper was there until I had to cut it to meet the size limit demanded by the conferees of these 8,000 words. The fundamental points that I think may divide us are two. The first pertains to my unconventional view of hegemony. And part of what divides us is, I think, the realist and liberal belief that material capabilities are determining and are the measure of all things. And I make the argument, which I certainly can elaborate further in the paper if I'm given, let's say, another 500 words, is to argue that it is a mistake to think, to conflate material capabilities with power and power with influence. That these are separate categories, that material capabilities are one component of power, and power is one component of influence. And influence is ultimately the ability to persuade people, which is context dependent, highly related to agency, and to pulling the right kinds of levers, and most importantly, in attempting to convince people what you want them to do is in their interest. And that it is a mistake by those who seek simple parsimonious explanations of the world to focus only on the material side. And they do this because it can be measured abstractly and divorced from context. And I think it's time we get beyond this kind of inadequate theorizing. When we do, and we examine hegemony in a more normative, rhetorical context that focuses on influence, the evidence for it largely disappears and suggests a very more nuanced way in which states relate and in which the United States relates to others. And one of the striking things here is the extent to which the U.S., even more than it used to, which is an indication, again, of its lack of hegemony, has to rely more on carrots and sticks than on persuasion and collaboration in convincing people where it should go.
Okay, I'll just be very brief. Thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to take them on board. I think the important point that you made is about China. And I think even though China is not the main subject of a lot of papers that are going to be discussed here, I think it's the elephant in the room. It's there. It's in the background. And this is something that came up at a roundtable that we had on Tuesday as well. That you kind of, especially if you're talking about Africa and emerging powers in Africa, you can talk about other powers, but you're doing that in the context of China being the big player there. And just some brief comments in terms of whether Africa sees China as a model. I think Africa has quite a pragmatic instrumentalist approach to China. So you're right, it sees China as a country that's willing to provide the goods without all the strings attached. And I mean, if public opinion is anything to go by, I've just completed a public opinion survey of ordinary South Africans, and the feeling that one gets from the answers is that they like some of China's, they like some aspects of the Chinese model, things like poverty alleviation, but they don't want to adopt the Chinese model of society wholesale. So they still prefer the American kind of liberal, values, and of course that has to do with American soft power largely as well. So I think there is a distinction between, we like certain things that China can provide, but we don't necessarily want to be like China. We certainly don't want to live in China. That was the other question. So thanks for that.
To be brief, since I'm talking about something that doesn't exist actually, so the idea of discussing the role of multilateral institutions is primarily to tackle the differences between northern and southern versions or visions on multilateral institutions. As you said, if the northern countries or western countries, they think about multilateral institutions as a way to include the entire globe or to have a more universal participation, as a way to provide order to the entire system, to the emerging powers, the intent or the meaning of this participation changes a lot. It's not only a matter of taking the multilateral arena as a site of contestation, it's a site of play. My theoretical claim was exactly that we should take we should take multilateralism as a site of play. There are, I guess, Acharyas and I guess Ned mentioned, for instance, R2P. R2P is not an American invention. It's a Scandinavian, Canadian invention, and it is a middle powers invention in that sense, which is quite consistent with the idea of a global order, with the idea of a new liberal order, but it is different from the American perspective, and it was created by middle powers. So multilateral arenas are sites of play, and these countries, they play with the norms, both southern countries and western countries as well. And if we take the consequences of R2P for BRICS countries, the first one is a completely rejection. The second one is an attempt to play with R2P as well. I guess India is doing that, Brazil is doing that, and South Africa is doing that as well. It's not a matter of completely reject this particular set of norms. The African Union, for instance, invented the idea of non-indifference, which was actually after that incorporated by Brazil, and Brazil tried to cope with the Libyan crisis with the idea of responsibility while protecting. And this is the play of these countries in this particular social setting, which is the multilateral setting. In a way, they are inventing these norms. There will be no, from my perspective, there will be no consensus among BRICS to create new norms. But what we are going to have in that sense is several plays creating several centers, or no center, if you want, of normative ordering. And just to finalize with this idea, this example of responsibility while protecting, this is fantastic because in a way it was an attempt to project power, Brazilian attempt to project power. It was really, really bad received by European countries in the first moment because it was really aftermath of the Libyan crisis. But after that, we discovered that first, the Europeans actually want to discuss that. But for Brazilians, there would be a problem because the Russians and the Chinese, they like the concept a lot, because it would be the opportunity to regulate and create the opportunity to use the concept without putting the concept in practice. So it would respond to Tibet, it would respond to Chechnya, and so on and so forth. And Brazil just withdraw the concept. Just stop to discuss this concept because it was this entanglement between Western powers and China and Russia from the other side. So the result we have is a completely paralysis of the entire system. That's my point. Thank you.
I completely agree with you, Charlie. A bit of Maoist self-criticism is in order. As I stated things, it was a bit too bald, and I think a bit more nuance might be appropriate. And I'll respond specifically to two issues. The first is, I think it's not simply the growth of material power that'll make a difference. I agree with you. I think it is going to be mediated with this interplay between sort of deep-seated ideational forces that exist in India's political culture and the growth of material power. I don't think it's an either-or proposition, and I think I really do need to tweak this. This is actually quite helpful. And the second, on this issue of notions of global inequality, this is where I think there's a great deal of hypocrisy in India, and I'll be fairly blunt about this here and both in the written form. Going back all the way to earlier discussions of sort of North-South relations, of the Brandt Commission, and of various or the creation of the new international economic order in 1973, India was at the forefront at many of these activities. But there was almost a blissful unawareness or a blissful obliviousness to domestic inequality. Here you are talking about all the inequities of the West and the structural problems of the global order, but what were you doing to alleviate domestic poverty or domestic inequality? And this issue has again been brought to the fore as India has experienced considerable economic growth. People like Amartya Sen have been scathingly critical, and I think appropriately so, about the people who have simply been passed over as India has experienced extraordinary prosperity and has some of the largest number of billionaires, and I don't mean rupee billionaires, because those are a dime a dozen. I mean dollar billionaires in Asia. So in large part, this whole discussion about global inequality and the need to address it is an attempt to largely thwart and sort of set aside domestic difficulties and the failures of domestic public policy, and instead simply suggest that were it not for this highly inequitable global order, everything in India would be like Sweden. Well, no, that's not the case. And I think this hypocrisy needs to be confronted head on.